prior to the 1450s, there was no such thing as the printing press. And the printing press was like the internet. It was one of these revolutionary inventions in human history that dramatically changed everything. And just like today, if you're dealing with someone who grew up after the internet and all they've ever known is the internet age, it can be very hard for them to put themselves in the position of like, wait, you mean you had to go to a library and you couldn't just whip out your smartphone and talk to someone at any time? And it's hard for them to imagine that world. And something similar applies to us and the age before the printing press. Prior to the printing press, every single book had to be copied by hand. And that meant books were fantastically expensive. I did some calculations once, and a single copy of the Gospel of Luke in the first century would have cost the equivalent of like $2,000. And so you can imagine, I mean, people working subsistence level jobs, many of them slaves, only the rich could afford a copy of even a single gospel. And that's why they went to church to hear them read. Not only were most people illiterate, but it was only by pooling their financial resources that people in church could together afford books of Scripture, because ordinary people couldn't afford them and couldn't read them anyway. And so that's basically the way it was for everybody, except the super rich, prior to the invention of the printing press. Then when the printing press was invented, no, you didn't have to pay scribes anymore. Once you set the type, you can run off thousands of copies. The price of books dropped dramatically to at least the point that the middle class, the growing middle class, can afford them. But if you put yourself in the first 1,400 years of church history mentally, in order for people to apply Sola Scriptura in a broad-based way, well, they would need copies of the Scriptures. And not just the Gospel of Luke. They'd need all of the Scriptures, because as the Westminster Confession acknowledges, not every passage is clear on its own. You would need to be able to appeal to other passages of Scripture elsewhere. So you'd need the whole thing. And that's something that people just didn't have. Even many churches did not have complete copies of the Scriptures. It was beyond their price range. And so I think it was a practical impossibility for Sola Scriptura to have been thinkable as a broad, everybody should implement this way of approaching the development of doctrine or the formulation of doctrine prior to the printing press. I think what happened was, at the time the printing press is invented, suddenly a lot more people can afford copies of the Scriptures, and people get excited, and it's like, wow, we could all read these for ourselves, and we've got all of them under a single bundle. Let's try to rethink things and see what we can get just by Scripture alone. And I think that was a natural tendency, but I think that was really the first point in history where Sola Scriptura on any kind of scale became thinkable. And so I don't think it was thinkable for the first at scale for the first 1,400 years of church history. I mean, maybe if you were a rich guy, you could afford a copy of all of the Scriptures and read them for yourself, or have your servants read them to you and do Sola Scriptura by yourself. But even allowing a role for councils and things, or church fathers and things. But it really wasn't something that people prior to the printing press, unless you were super rich, could envision doing. So I would think I would find that, and I found that, a historical challenge to the idea that it's something Christians should be doing. Because if that was God's design for how Christians should approach the question of authority, it wouldn't have been something we'd have to wait more than 1,400 years to apply.
So I would ask my Protestant friend, find me any or all texts of the Bible that say all Christian doctrines must be established by these 66 books. It's not there. It's not there. So the doctrine fails its own test of authority. It is inconsistent. It is incoherent, because the doctrine of Sola Scriptura cannot be established as an article of faith on the express words of Scripture. So that's number one. All right. Number two, and this is kind of a functional problem with Sola Scriptura. If you hold to the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, how do you, in principle, differentiate dogma from opinion? Let me tell you what I mean. Let us say that two Protestants read the Bible and they come up with divergent interpretations. All right? And so they understand some doctrine differently. How do you know, what principled means is there to determine whether their disagreement is substantive such that they have to break fellowship with one another? Like, this is a dogma, line in the sand, and I can't have fellowship with you because you're no longer an Orthodox Christian. How do they determine whether their disagreement rises to that level of significance? I would contend that the doctrine of Sola Scriptura gives you no principled way to answer that question. Because the problem is worse than that Protestants disagree with one another. It's worse than that. That's a fact. That's evident. They disagree. But we can't tell, based on the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, whether the disagreements that Protestants have with one another are substantive, whether or not they constitute a legitimate reason for church rupture. And look, Scripture commands us to be in agreement on everything. How do you know how to apply that rule if you're a Protestant? Let me give you an illustration of the difficulty. As just kind of an empirical fact, most evangelical Protestants today kind of hunker down and say the essentials of the faith are things like the atoning death of Christ and salvation by faith alone, and probably the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. If you got that, you got what you need. Well, how did they arrive at that list of essentials? Where'd that list come from? Why not other essentials? If you drive back into the 16th century and you look at the early history of Protestantism, that was not the position. Not the position. Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, and Cranmer too for that matter, but especially Luther and Calvin, believed that the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist was an essential article of faith in the Christian religion and absolutely necessitated excommunication or schism if you could not arrive in agreement. So, for example, Zwingli did not believe in the doctrine of the real presence. Luther did. And because Zwingli denied that doctrine, Luther considered Zwingli to be an instrument of the Antichrist.
Wow.
A servant of Satan, cut off from redemption and the household of God. Ooh. In 1541, I think it was, this is 41 or 43, Calvin wrote a book called A Little Treatise on the Lord's Supper, in which he also articulated the position that the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist was tant nécessaire au salut. That was his French phrase. So necessary for salvation. Ironically, he had a different interpretation from Luther, but he agreed that it was substantive and it was something over which the church had to split. No Protestant today that I know holds that point of view. Why not? Why not? The fact of the matter is they just will never agree on the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, so they've given it up as an essential doctrine. Not for any principled reason, but just because they can't actually arrive at agreement, so they've quit trying. All right. So the doctrine of Sola Scriptura is incoherent. It's not functional. Like, it's abortive from the get-go because you can't even use it to arrive at an objective consensus about what the Christian faith is.
One subject that we haven't even gotten into is the way in which we have knowledge of the canon of Scripture. And it's clear. Now, actually, the precise boundaries of the canon of Scripture are not urgent for a person who uses the apostolic paradigm, because if there is a dispute, the magisterium can clear it up. So it's not urgent for a person who uses the apostolic paradigm to have a precise knowledge of the boundaries of Scripture. But it is urgent for someone who believes in Sola Scriptura, because if you accept even one book that is not inspired as authoritative for faith, you've corrupted your deposit of faith and will draw erroneous conclusions. Similarly, if you reject even one book that is divinely inspired, you have truncated your deposit of faith and will not be able to have doctrines that God wanted you to have, certainly not with the same level of confidence. Consequently, that's why the issue of the canon of Scripture became critical at the time of the Reformation, because it was when the doctrine of Sola Scriptura emerged. Prior to that time, the church had not seen the need to infallibly define it. And it took centuries to work out. By the early 4th century, you had, as Eusebius of Caesarea describes, you have certain books that everybody's confident of, like the 4 Gospels. You have certain books that everybody is confident do not belong in Scripture, like the Canon of Marcion. And then you have other books that are kind of in the middle, and some Christians accept them and some don't. And they were okay living with that ambiguity because they weren't using Sola Scriptura. Eventually, by the end of the 4th century, you get a more definite New Testament canon. And on what basis and the way you got that was by acts of the magisterium. You had local councils publishing canon lists, which they then sent to the Pope for confirmation. And then those authoritative canon lists were promulgated throughout Christendom. So even though it wasn't infallible yet, this was the magisterium developing the canon of Scripture and discerning which books are genuinely inspired and which are not. But on what basis did they discern that? Well, it was tradition. And it was tradition in 2 different ways. The first way was, did a book have a tradition of being read in the churches as Scripture? If a new book showed up out of nowhere and there was no tradition of it being read in the churches, they would say that is not authoritative Scripture. There is no tradition of churches reading that. Secondly, it was based on an internal criterion of tradition, where if they read a book and let's say it had Gnostic teaching in it that disagreed with the doctrinal tradition that had been passed down from the apostles, they would say this is also disqualified. It disagrees with the doctrinal tradition that has been passed down. And so we see the early magisterium using the criterion of tradition, both in terms of the reading of books as Scripture in churches and of do they agree with the doctrinal tradition of the apostles. That was how we got the canon of the New Testament and, frankly, the canon of the Old Testament too. So we see the church authoritatively using tradition that is not in Scripture, because there's no divinely inspired table of contents, using it centuries after the death of the last apostle to authoritatively determine what books are we going to regard as authoritative. And not only do we do that today, Protestants do that, because individual Protestants do not revisit the canon of the New Testament, not most of them. They, at some point in their lives, whether it was in a Christian bookstore or as a Christmas present from someone, or at some point in their lives, someone handed them a Bible and said, this is Scripture, and they accepted it. They literally had the Bible traditioned or handed on to them and accept the tradition that they received as authoritative, even though there's no divinely inspired table of contents. And so we see tradition being used as authoritative, albeit without recognizing it for what it is, in the Protestant community as well as in the Catholic community.